The alien in hiding. Kayla had been on Earth for 3 years, hiding in the shadows, learning the human ways without ever truly integrating. Her species, the Xerians, had been driven to the brink of extinction in an unjust war. Earth's military, led by ruthless commanders, had launched a brutal assault on her world. With most of her kind wiped out, she had fled here, to the one place her enemies had yet to conquer. She had hoped Earth would be a safe haven, a distant planet where she could heal, regroup, and eventually rebuild. But the humans here saw her kind as nothing more than monsters. All the rumors, all the propaganda told them that the Xerian species would one day destroy their world. Kayla could feel the weight of that fear in every human she encountered. She was an outsider, unwanted and mistrusted. The noise of the bustling city outside her safe house was a constant reminder that she was alone. The humans did not welcome aliens, especially those who had come from a world they saw as an enemy. Kayla's only interactions were with those who came for her in the dark of night, the military hunters who had been dispatched to ensure no alien remnants survived on Earth. She knew they were getting closer. Their scent lingered in the air, their heavy footsteps echoing in the distance as they combed the city for her. They were relentless, the humans who were tasked with eliminating what was left of her kind. Kayla had heard their whispers through the thin walls of her safe house. They would find her. It was only a matter of time. But even though her fear was palpable, Kayla refused to give in. She had seen her people slaughtered, betrayed, and torn apart by the humans. She was the last of her kind, and she would not die quietly. Her gaze shifted to the small screen in the corner of the room. It flickered as an incoming transmission appeared, a face she had not expected. Mark, the human soldier who had been sent to find her. She had crossed paths with him once before. She had caught a glimpse of his face, framed by the dark helmet of a soldier, his stance resolute and unwavering. To Kayla, he was just another human who had come to end her life. But there was something about him, something that made her hesitate. The transmission flickered once more, and Kayla's heart raced. She had not expected him to contact her. The conflict within. Mark's orders were clear: find the alien and bring her back, dead or alive. But as he trudged through the dense forest on the outskirts of the city, his thoughts began to cloud with doubt. The higher-ups had told him Kayla was a threat, a dangerous being who posed a risk to humanity. His mission was straightforward: eliminate her before she could retaliate. But he hadn't expected it to feel so personal. He had studied the files, read the reports about her species, the Xerian people. They were said to be violent invaders, wiping out civilizations in their wake. Yet every time Mark came closer to the truth, he found himself questioning those reports. The more he learned about Kayla, the more he began to wonder if she was truly the monster they made her out to be. The last time he saw her, just a fleeting moment before she vanished into the night, he had felt something he couldn't ignore. Fear? Yes, but also something else, compassion. For a brief instant, he wondered if she was just like him, struggling to survive in a world that didn't want her. Mark couldn't shake the image of Kayla's fearful eyes, staring at him from the shadows. She had looked at him as if he were a predator, as if the mere sight of him meant certain death. But that wasn't what Mark was. He wasn't a killer, at least not by choice. As he ventured deeper into the wilderness, Mark's mind raced. What was he doing? Was he really going to follow through with this mission? Would he capture her and bring her back for the slaughter, or would he find another way? Suddenly, the sound of rustling branches snapped him out of his thoughts. Mark instinctively reached for the gun at his side, preparing himself for whatever came next. But it wasn't Kayla who emerged from the underbrush. Instead, a group of rogue soldiers stepped into view, their faces hidden behind dark masks. Mark's pulse quickened as he recognized their insignias: rogue operatives, military deserters who had been operating outside the law. They weren't here to capture Kayla. They were here to kill her and anyone who got in their way. One of the soldiers, a tall man with a cruel sneer, pointed his weapon directly at Mark. Well, if it isn't one of our finest soldiers," the man mocked, stepping closer. "Are you here to help her, soldier, or are you here to make her suffer just like the rest of her kind?" Mark's grip tightened on his weapon. "I'm not here to hurt her," he said, voice steady despite the rising tension. The rogue soldier laughed, his voice full of malice. "You don't get to choose, soldier. You're either with us or against us, and if you're against us, you're dead." Before Mark could react, another soldier moved swiftly behind him, pushing him to the ground. Mark's weapon was knocked from his hands, and he struggled to regain his footing. "Let me go," Mark shouted, pushing back against the weight of his assailant. But it was too late. The rogue soldiers had surrounded him, and they weren't interested in negotiation. They had their orders: eliminate anyone who stood in their way, and Mark, unfortunately, had just made himself an enemy. At that moment, Mark heard a familiar voice, Kayla's voice. It was faint but clear. She was close. "Get away from him," Kayla's voice rang out from behind the trees. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He turned his head just in time to see Kayla emerging from the shadows, her eyes blazing with anger and fear. Before Mark could call out to her, the rogue soldiers turned their weapons on her. They were determined to finish what they had started. Mark's instincts kicked in. He had no time to think, no time to weigh the consequences. Without thinking, he pushed the soldier who had pinned him to the ground aside and grabbed his gun. "No," Mark shouted, aiming the weapon at the rogue soldiers. "She's not your enemy." The leader of the rogue operatives snarled, "You've made a grave mistake, soldier." Mark's hands trembled as he held the weapon steady, aiming directly at the rogue soldier who was about to shoot Kayla. His heart pounded in his chest. The situation had escalated beyond his control. Kayla looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice filled with confusion. "I don't know," Mark replied, struggling to comprehend the whirlwind of emotions racing through him. "But I can't let them hurt you." The rogue soldiers took a step back, eyeing each other with uncertainty. They hadn't expected Mark to defy them, to stand up against them for an alien. "Get out of here," Mark demanded, his voice low and commanding. "I won't say it again." The rogue soldiers hesitated for a moment, weighing their options. But seeing that Mark was serious, and knowing that there was no way they could overpower him with just a few of them, they backed away slowly, retreating into the woods. Mark lowered his weapon and turned to Kayla, his heart still racing. "You're safe," he said, though he wasn't sure if that was true, not yet. Kayla stood frozen, staring at him. Her expression was a mix of shock and suspicion, as if she couldn't quite understand what had just happened. You helped me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did," Mark said quietly, his hand still gripping the gun. "I don't know why, but I couldn't let them hurt you." Kayla stepped back, her eyes scanning his face as if searching for any signs of deception. "Why?" she repeated. "I thought all humans were the same." Mark's chest tightened. He could hear the pain in her voice, the years of suffering and betrayal she had endured. She didn't trust him, and he didn't blame her. But something about her, something in her eyes, made him want to protect her. "I'm not like them," he said, lowering his weapon entirely. "I don't believe everything they've told me about you. I don't think you're the enemy." Kayla's expression softened just a little. "And what if you're wrong?" "I guess I'll find out," Mark replied. For a long moment, they stood there in the silence of the forest, each of them unsure of what would come next. But for the first time in a long time, Kayla felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this human wasn't the monster she thought him to be. Maybe he was her chance to survive. Maybe he could be the one to save her. The hidden truths. The air was thick with tension as Mark and Kayla navigated the dense forest. The shadows of the trees seemed to close in around them, making their every step feel heavier. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the underbrush, but neither of them dared to break the silence that stretched between them. It had been a day since Mark had made the decision to protect Kayla, and while the rogue soldiers had been driven off, the uncertainty of their survival still lingered. Mark was still trying to process what had happened. How had he gone from being a soldier on a mission to defending an alien who was supposed to be his enemy? His mind kept replaying the moment he had pointed the gun at the rogue soldiers. It had been a split-second decision, but there was no turning back now. His loyalty to the military had always been unwavering, but Kayla had done something to him, something he couldn't quite explain. The doubt he had felt for weeks had bloomed into something stronger, something he wasn't prepared to confront. As they walked, Kayla remained a few steps ahead, her eyes scanning the surroundings. She moved with the grace of someone who had lived in constant fear and danger, her every sense heightened. Mark couldn't help but admire her, though he wasn't sure if it was admiration or pity that stirred inside him. Kayla glanced over her shoulder, her piercing eyes meeting Mark's. "You've helped me, but why?" Mark opened his mouth to answer, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. He had been trying to rationalize it since he had made the decision to help her. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice rough. "Something in me I couldn't let them hurt you." Kayla's expression softened, but the wariness in her gaze remained. I don't understand. Why would you help someone like me? My kind destroyed your world. We've taken so much from humanity. Mark's heart tightened at the mention of his planet's devastation. He had lost friends, family, and everything he had known during the war. But even as he remembered the pain, he couldn't bring himself to hate her. He had seen the fear in her eyes, the same fear he had seen in the eyes of those he cared about when the war had first begun. Was it possible that Kayla was not the enemy? Could it be that the conflict between their two species was built on lies, misconceptions, and manipulation? Mark took a deep breath. I've learned enough to know that not everything is as it seems. I don't believe all of you are evil. Kayla stopped in her tracks, turning to face him. You think I'm innocent? I think I'm starting to see that you're more like me than I realized, Mark replied. I'm not sure who told you we were enemies, but I don't think it's that simple. Kayla studied him for a long moment, and Mark could almost see the internal struggle in her eyes. She had been trained to mistrust humans, to see them as nothing more than a threat. But something in her had shifted. She could see that Mark was different, that he was not a part of the machine that had destroyed her homeworld. You're not like the others, Kayla said quietly. Mark gave a faint smile. No, I'm not. They continued walking in silence, the only sound the crunching of leaves beneath their feet. Mark was beginning to feel a strange sense of camaraderie with Kayla, even though he still didn't fully understand her past or the intricacies of her species. But as he glanced over at her, he saw the exhaustion in her face, the weight of everything she had endured. After hours of walking, they reached a small, dilapidated cabin hidden deep in the forest. It was a safe house, one of many that Mark had learned about during his time in the military, a place where soldiers could regroup and lay low without being tracked. He had once used these hideouts when he was in the field, but now it felt strange to be leading Kayla to one of them. This is where we'll stay for a while, Mark said, pushing open the door and stepping inside. You'll be safe here. Kayla hesitated, her eyes flickering over the small, cramped interior of the cabin. Safe, she repeated, almost to herself. Mark turned on the lights and set down his bag. For now, yes, but we need to talk. Kayla finally stepped inside, her eyes wary but resigned. She had no other choice. Mark had kept his word so far, and for now she had to trust him. About what? She asked, folding her arms tightly across her chest. Mark closed the door behind her and took a seat at the small wooden table in the center of the room. About everything. About why you're really here. Kayla looked at him, her expression unreadable. I've told you the truth. I've told you about my people, how we were attacked without warning. Mark nodded. But I don't think that's the whole story. I think there's more to it. You've been hiding for a reason, Kayla. You're not just running from the humans, you're running from something else. Kayla was silent for a long moment, her gaze falling to the floor. She was torn. On one hand, she had always been taught to keep her secrets buried deep, never to trust anyone outside her species. On the other hand, Mark had risked everything to protect her. It was hard to ignore the bond that was slowly forming between them. She sighed and sat down across from him. You're right, there's more, but it's not something I can just tell you, it's dangerous. Mark leaned forward, his brow furrowing. I'm not going anywhere. If you're going to trust me, you have to trust me completely. Whatever it is, I can handle it. Kayla hesitated, but finally met his gaze. The truth is, the war between our species wasn't just about territory or resources. It was orchestrated. It was planned. Mark blinked, confusion flashing across his face. Planned. Yes, Kayla said softly. The humans weren't the only ones responsible for the war. There were others, those who manipulated both our people for their own gain. Mark shook his head, trying to process the gravity of her words. Who? Why? The rogue soldiers who attacked us, the ones who have been hunting us down, they're not just out for blood. They're part of a larger conspiracy, a group of humans with power who want to control both your world and mine. Mark's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. Are you saying this is all some kind of setup? Kayla nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, and it's bigger than both of us. Unraveling the conspiracy. Mark's mind swirled with Kayla's words, each one heavier than the last. The idea that everything he thought he knew was built on lies was almost too much to bear. For years, he had been trained to believe that the Xerians were nothing but enemies, invaders who came to Earth with bloodlust and destruction in mind. But Kayla's revelation had shattered that illusion. She wasn't just a soldier of an alien species. She was someone who had been manipulated and used just like him. He sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend the implications of what she had just said. The war between humans and Xerians hadn't been a natural conflict. It had been engineered by someone. But who? And why? And most importantly, what did this mean for the future? Kayla watched him carefully, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. She knew how hard it would be for Mark to accept the truth, but she also understood that he was her best chance for survival. The rogue soldiers who had attacked them weren't just random enemies. They were part of a much larger and more sinister plan. "Mark," Kayla said quietly, breaking the silence. "I didn't come here to destroy your world. I didn't have a choice. My people, we were pushed into a war that was never ours to fight." Mark looked up at her, his expression filled with doubt and confusion. "But why didn't you tell anyone? Why did you stay silent all this time?" Kayla's face softened with sadness. "Because I had no one to trust. We've been hunted, pushed to the fringes of the galaxy. When the war started, we tried to reach out for peace, but it was already too late. We were branded as monsters, as invaders, and the humans that could have helped us were either too scared or too blinded by hate to listen." Mark felt a pang of guilt. He had been one of those humans, wasn't he? The ones who had been so eager to label the Xerians as enemies. He had never questioned the narrative that had been shoved down his throat. But now, listening to Kayla, he realized just how easily he had been manipulated. "I'm sorry," Mark said, his voice full of regret. "I should have questioned things, but everything we've been told, everything I've been trained to believe, it's been hard to let go of." Kayla nodded, understanding the weight of the burden he carried. "I know. I've had to carry that same weight for years, but it's time for the truth to come out, Mark. The people who started this war, they're still out there and they're still pulling the strings." Mark clenched his fists, anger building inside him. "Who are they? Who's behind all of this?" Kayla hesitated for a moment, glancing out of the small cabin's window into the dark forest beyond. "The ones who are behind this, they're not just rogue soldiers. They're the highest ranks of your military, some of the most powerful individuals on Earth. They've been using the war between humans and Xerians as a way to consolidate power and wealth. They've manipulated both our species for their own gain." Mark's heart sank. The idea that people in positions of power were responsible for the death and destruction that had plagued his world felt like a punch to the gut. He had spent so many years following orders, believing that he was protecting humanity. But now, everything he had fought for felt like a lie. "But why would they want to destroy us both?" Mark asked, struggling to understand the motives behind such an elaborate plan. Kayla looked at him with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "Because war is profitable. It generates resources, control, and influence. They've been pitting our people against each other to create chaos, to keep both of us distracted while they build their own empire in the shadows. And when the war is over, they'll be the ones left standing, richer and more powerful than ever." Mark felt sick to his stomach. "You're telling me this was all just a game to them? Lives lost, entire civilizations destroyed, all for profit?" "Yes," Kayla said, her voice quiet but resolute. "And they've been doing it for years. This war was only the beginning." Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the raw, explosive anger that surged within him. He had been used, manipulated into fighting a war that wasn't even his to fight. He had lost everything for a cause that wasn't just unjust, it was manufactured. "I can't believe this," Mark muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I've been a pawn in someone's game all these years." Kayla stood up and walked over to him. "I know it's hard, but now we have to do something about it. We can't let them continue to destroy us." Mark turned to face her, his mind racing. He had always been trained to follow orders, to trust his commanders, to fight for the greater good. But now he didn't know who to trust. The people he had thought were on his side, his own government, his own military, were the very ones who had set the war into motion. "How do we stop them?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Kayla's eyes met his, and for the first time since they had met, Mark saw something different in her eyes. It was a spark of hope, of determination. She wasn't just a soldier, she wasn't just an alien. She was someone who had lost everything and was still willing to fight for what was right. "We go after them," Kayla said simply. "We expose them for what they are, and we stop their plans before they can destroy any more lives." Mark nodded, the fire of resolve burning inside him. He wasn't going to let this conspiracy continue. He wasn't going to sit idly by while those in power continued to manipulate the fate of entire civilizations. He had been a soldier, yes, but now he had a new purpose: to fight for the truth, for justice, and for the lives that had been lost in this endless war. "I'm with you," he said, his voice firm. Kayla smiled, though the weight of their mission hung heavily in the air. "Good, because we're going to need all the help we can get." The future was uncertain, and the road ahead would be treacherous. But for the first time in a long while, Mark felt like he had a reason to keep going. And for Kayla, it was the first step toward redemption, a chance to make things right. The final stand. The days that followed were filled with planning, strategizing, and a quiet, growing sense of purpose. Mark and Kayla spent hours together in the small cabin, piecing together fragments of information. They didn't have much to go on, just a few scattered pieces of intelligence and a vague sense of who was behind the conspiracy. But that was enough. They were both determined to bring the truth to light and stop the people who had orchestrated the destruction of their worlds. It wasn't easy. Mark had to confront the uncomfortable truth that many of the people he had once trusted were now enemies. The high-ranking officers he had served under, the ones who had given him orders. He now had to face the reality that they had all been complicit in the war that had devastated his home and killed countless innocent people. The betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow, but there was no time for hesitation. "I can't believe how deep this goes," Mark said one evening, his voice hoarse with frustration. He stood by the window, staring out into the darkening woods, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "I thought I was doing the right thing. All this time I thought I was fighting for humanity." Kayla sat across from him, her eyes focused on a map that lay open on the table. She had been quiet for a while, as if deep in thought. "You were," she said finally, looking up. "You were fighting for a cause that wasn't real, but now you're fighting for something that is, for the truth." Mark turned to face her, his expression hardening. "And we're going to expose that truth, no matter what it costs." Kayla's eyes flickered with something unspoken, regret perhaps, or fear, but she nodded. She had seen the destruction that war brought. She had seen it in her own people, and she had seen it in the eyes of the humans who fought against her kind. No one had come out of this conflict unscathed, but now they had the chance to change everything. For the next few days, they worked tirelessly, contacting old allies, gathering what information they could, and making plans to confront those responsible for the war. They knew they couldn't do it alone. Mark called in favors, reaching out to soldiers who had once been his comrades, men and women who were disillusioned with the war and the lies they had been told. Kayla reached out to Zirians she trusted, those who had managed to survive the war and had valuable intel. The moment they had been waiting for arrived when they learned of a high-ranking military meeting that was set to take place in a hidden underground facility. This was where the conspiracy's architects gathered, where the final plans for the next phase of the war were being made. It was their chance to strike, to expose the truth, and take down the people who had been manipulating both humans and Zirians for their own gain. Mark and Kayla, along with a small group of trusted allies, infiltrated the facility under the cover of darkness. They moved quickly, expertly dodging security systems and avoiding patrols. Mark's heart raced with every step, the weight of the mission bearing down on him. This was it. This was their chance to make everything right. As they approached the inner chambers of the facility, Kayla stopped, her hand on Mark's arm. "There's something you need to know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The people we're facing, they're not just humans. Some of them are hybrids, part human, part Zirians. They've been using both our species to further their goals." Mark's stomach churned at the thought. Hybrids, the very idea seemed impossible. How is that even possible? Kayla's gaze darkened. "It's not something I can explain fully, but these hybrids were created for one purpose, to be the perfect soldiers. They were raised to infiltrate both our societies and manipulate our leaders." Mark swallowed hard, his mind racing with the implications. "So they've been controlling both sides of the war." Kayla nodded. "Yes, and now they're trying to erase all evidence of their involvement. If we don't stop them, they'll succeed, and the war will continue forever." With a sense of urgency, they pressed on, finally reaching the heart of the facility. Inside, they found the war room, a large, sterile space filled with monitors, maps, and documents. At the center of it all sat the people who had orchestrated the war, the men and women who had betrayed their own people for power and profit. Mark's pulse quickened as he and Kayla stepped into the room. They weren't expecting to find all of them there. It was a trap, a final test of their resolve. The door slammed shut behind them, locking them inside. "We've been expecting you," a cold voice echoed from the shadows. Mark tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, but Kayla stopped him. "No, let me," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "This is my fight, too." With a swift motion, she raised her hand, and a low hum filled the room. A hologram flickered to life, showing images of the war and the devastation that had been caused by the conspiracy. The figures in the shadows flinched at the sight. "We've seen your manipulation," Kayla said, her voice steady. "We've seen the destruction you've caused. It ends now." The figures in the shadows began to move, and Mark's instincts kicked in. But before he could act, Kayla raised her hand again, and a force field surrounded them. The traitors were trapped. "You can't stop this," one of the men sneered. "You're too late." Kayla's eyes narrowed. "We're never too late. The truth will always come to light." With a swift motion, she deactivated the force field, and chaos erupted. Mark and Kayla fought side by side, the culmination of everything they had worked for, fighting not just for their own survival, but for the survival of both their peoples. After the battle was over, the room was silent. The conspirators had been taken down, their plan thwarted. Mark and Kayla stood amidst the wreckage, their breathing heavy but triumphant. They had done it. The war would finally end. As they walked out of the facility, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. It was a new beginning, a future not defined by lies and manipulation, but by the truth. They had been through the fire together, and they had emerged stronger for it. Mark looked at Kayla, his gaze filled with gratitude and respect. "You were right. The truth always comes to light." Kayla smiled, the weight of the years of war finally lifting from her shoulders. "It does, and now we can rebuild." The road ahead would be long, and the scars of the past would take time to heal. But with Mark and Kayla's determination, there was hope for a future where both humans and Xyrians could live in peace.